On a suffocating July night in 2002, the Red River moved like black glass through Shreveport, heavy with heat and secrets. The sky hung low, swollen with storm clouds that threatened to burst but never quite did, the air thick enough to taste. Somewhere along the levee, a two-year-old nursing student named Camille Harper took her last breath of freedom. She'd finished her late shift at the urgent care clinic, clocked out at 11:48 p.m., and called her mother to say she was heading home. She never finished that call. Her car was found idling the next morning by the levee road, headlights on, keys in the ignition, driver's door open. Her purse lay on the passenger seat, soaked from dew. Her phone half-charged and still redialing her mother's number. On the gravel beside it, a single shoe. The kind she always wore to work, white, soft-soled, sensible. To the people of Shreveport, it didn't make sense. Camille wasn't reckless. She wasn't the type to wander off or get caught in the wrong place. She was the girl who worked double shifts, brought homemade pie to her neighbors, and tutored younger nursing students in her spare time. But that night, something stopped her in the dark, something she never saw coming. By dawn, the quiet stretch of the river had turned into a crime scene. Patrol cars lined the road, and police tape fluttered in the humidity. Reporters called it a disappearance, but her mother, Evelyn Harper, called it what it was, a theft. "Someone took my daughter," she said, her voice sharp as cracked glass. "And I won't stop until I take her back." That was the moment the town began to fracture between those who wanted to forget and those who couldn't. Have you ever driven home thinking danger was miles away only to find it waiting for you? By noon the next day, every local volunteer with a flashlight and a conscience was combing the banks of the Red River. Boats scraped the surface, and officers waded through the mud, while helicopters circled above, their rotors chopping through the humid air. Every sweep of a spotlight revealed only driftwood, beer cans, and shadows that refused to give answers. Evelyn Harper stood on the levee in her slippers, arms folded tight around herself, as if holding her daughter's shape inside her chest. People came up to her, neighbors, co-workers, strangers, all offering the same useless phrases. "She's strong. She'll turn up." But Evelyn didn't want comfort. She wanted truth. She stared at the water as though daring it to give her Camille back. The police tried to reassure her. They said it was too soon to assume the worst. They said people vanish for reasons. Evelyn only laughed bitter, hollow. "People don't vanish," she snapped. "They're taken. Someone took my girl, and you're all too late to stop it." The town began to hum with theories. Some said she ran off with a secret lover. Others whispered about her ex, or the preacher's son, or the man in the silver truck who was seen parked by the levee that night. For a city that prided itself on being close-knit, trust began to rot faster than the river's edge. By the third day, the search parties grew smaller. The news cameras left. The town moved on. Only Evelyn stayed, rooted to that same spot on the levee every evening, staring at the water that had swallowed her child's name. The Red River carried on like nothing had happened. But Shreveport knew better. The current had changed. What would you do if the place you loved most refused to tell you where your child went? By the end of that week, the search for Camille Harper had turned into quiet resignation. The town that once flooded the levee with flashlights and prayers now whispered her name like a curse they didn't want to speak too loud. The flyers taped to store windows faded under the sun, and the police updates slowed until there were none at all. Shreveport had decided it was time to move on. But Evelyn Harper didn't. She left her porch light burning through the nights and refused to wash her daughter's uniform still hanging over the chair. Every sound, the ring of a phone, the slam of a car door, made her heart stop just long enough to hurt. She wrote Camille's name in her prayer book every morning, her handwriting shaking more with each passing day. When the pastor told her, "You have to let God handle it," she looked him straight in the eye and said, "God had 20 years. Now, it's my turn." The river, though, stayed the same. Still, patient, pretending innocence, while holding the truth deep within. People began to say that on still nights, if you stood by the water, you could hear a ringtone drifting through the fog, the echo of a call that never finished. For most, it was superstition. For Evelyn, it was a reminder. That river had taken her daughter, and she swore one day it would speak. But that night, it didn't whisper, it didn't roar, it simply watched as the lights dimmed and the town's hope sank beneath the surface. By morning, her laughter had vanished from Shreveport, and the river had learned to keep its secrets. Before we dive in, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. If you enjoy true crime stories like this, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and share it with someone who'd love it too. Detective Alan Broussard had seen plenty of missing person cases in his 20 years on the force, but something about Camille Harper's disappearance sank its claws into him from the first day. Maybe it was her age young enough to still dream, old enough to think she was safe. Maybe it was her mother, Evelyn, who wouldn't stop calling the station, demanding updates no one could give. Or maybe it was the silence that followed the case, the kind of silence that felt like an accusation. The investigation began with urgency, the entire department thrown into motion. Patrol cars scoured the levee roads, officers knocking on doors and digging through brush along the Red River's edge. The locals brought food and flashlights, helping until exhaustion blurred their faces into one anxious crowd. Broussard stood at the center of it all, staring at the open car door and the half-lit phone still lying on the seat. 5 minutes, he muttered. She was 5 minutes from home. He ordered the area sealed and brought in crime scene technicians from Baton Rouge. They cataloged what they could. Tire tracks from a truck that didn't belong to Camille, faint footprints that faded before they reached the waterline, and a broken bracelet chain buried in the dirt near the passenger side. No fingerprints, no blood, no signs of a struggle, just fragments of something that didn't want to be found. By the third day, Broussard's office looked like a war room. Maps covered the walls, threads connecting locations, timelines, and the last people who saw Camille alive. Her ex-boyfriend, Eli Turner, was brought in for questioning. He claimed they hadn't spoken in months, that he was working night shifts at the mill. His alibi held. Then came the whispers about Deacon Paul Hatcher, a well-known preacher who'd once tutored Camille in Bible study. Locals claimed he'd shown unusual interest in her, too many late-night calls, too many rides home from church. But when questioned, Hatcher spoke like a man who'd already rehearsed his innocence, calm, gentle, unshakable. Broussard wasn't convinced, but without evidence, all he could do was circle the same shadows. "Someone knows what happened," he told his team one night, voice low, jaw tight. "But they're hiding behind prayer and power." The Red River rolled past the city as if mocking their effort. No body, no closure, no progress, just more questions, and a mother who refused to stop asking them. Would you keep searching if the whole town begged you to stop? Rumors spread through Shreveport faster than any official report could keep up. Every front porch conversation, every late-night diner whisper, circled back to the same two names: Eli Turner and Deacon Paul Hatcher. One was the jealous ex-boyfriend with a short temper, the other a man of God with too many locked doors at his church. Detective Alan Broussard divided his team. Half pursued Turner, who swore he was innocent. Half shadowed Hatcher, whose charm made him untouchable. Turner cracked first, not with guilt, but with anger. "You think I did this?" he shouted during questioning, slamming his hands against the table. "You think I'd hurt her? She left me because I was broke, not because she was scared." His alibi checked out again. Backed by co-workers and time-stamped punch cards, Broussard wanted to believe him, but he also knew innocence didn't always come with proof. Meanwhile, the church was turning defensive. Deacon Hatcher gave sermons about forgiveness and false judgment, looking straight into the news cameras as if preaching to the police themselves. His followers nodded, the community divided. Some said the investigation had turned into a witch hunt. Others whispered that he'd used counseling sessions to lure young women into private meetings. Every week that passed tightened the town's tension until faith itself began to feel like a mask. Through it all, Evelyn Harper became the beating heart of the case. Her voice was sharp, desperate, unstoppable. She visited the precinct daily, sometimes to pray, sometimes to scream. Broussard respected her persistence, but feared what it was doing to her. She'd aged in weeks, eyes hollow, hair gray at the edges, hope slowly calcifying into fury. When Broussard hesitated to name a suspect publicly, Evelyn lost her restraint. She stood on the courthouse steps with Camille's picture in her hands and shouted to the reporters, "He's in this town! He walks among you, shaking your hands, taking your money, pretending to bless your children. Find him before he finds someone else." That clip replayed on every local station for days. Some called her brave, others called her unstable, but everyone watched. In homes, in pews, in police cars, the line between guilt and faith blurred. Shreveport wasn't just hunting a killer anymore. It was hunting the truth, and nobody could agree where to start looking. By the summer of 2004, Detective Alan Broussard had exhausted every lead the department could fund, every rumor the public could invent, and every ounce of patience the city council had left. The case of Camille Harper had become political poison. Too many sermons, too many protests, too many headlines, calling the investigation a failure. The mayor's office wanted it off the books. The district attorney wanted it out of sight. Broussard wanted one thing: 5 more minutes of truth. But truth, like the river, refused to move. The lab results were inconclusive. The footprints were too faded. The tire marks too common. Even the broken bracelet chain, once their best hope, turned out to be a store-bought piece with no traceable owner. The only thing Broussard could still hold on to was the faint smell of mud from that first night, the scent that clung to his memory long after the files went cold. The town's attention drifted elsewhere. A new scandal, a new crime, a new face on the news. People stopped asking about Camille Harper. Even those who'd once searched for her began to say her name with discomfort, as if speaking it might invite misfortune. The church reopened its doors, the sermons resumed, and Deacon Hatcher stood once again before his congregation, unchallenged and unshaken. Evelyn Harper didn't forgive them. She didn't forgive anyone. She turned her house into a shrine, walls covered in clippings, the living room overtaken by candles and case notes she copied by hand. When the city cut funding to Broussard's department, she sent letters to senators, to talk shows, to anyone who would listen. Most never replied. The few who did called her a grieving mother, lost to obsession. When Broussard retired, he packed up his files but kept one folder separate, case number CH-2002. He placed it gently in his personal cabinet, locked it, and slid the key into his pocket. "She deserved better," he said quietly. "We both did." Outside, the Red River flowed as it always had, steady, wide, and heartless. They sealed the file in a cabinet, and a mother sealed her grief inside her bones. Would you keep searching if the whole town begged you to stop? The calendar turned, but Evelyn Harper's grief did not. By 2003, most of Shreveport had stopped talking about her daughter. But Evelyn never stopped writing. Every month, without fail, she sent a letter to the police department, same format, same signature, same demand. "What are you doing for Camille Harper?" Sometimes it was Detective Alan Broussard who answered. Sometimes it was no one at all. She didn't care. The act itself had become her ritual, a battle against being forgotten. The letters piled up in police archives, unopened after the first few years. Secretaries sighed when they saw the return address. Officers rolled their eyes. To them, it was a ghost story that refused to die. To Evelyn, it was all she had left. Her days followed a rhythm of loss. Morning coffee brewed beside a framed photograph of Camille in her nursing uniform. The house smelled faintly of lavender and dust, like time trying to stand still. Neighbors stopped visiting because they never knew what to say. Her pastor came by once, Bible in hand, and gently told her to let go. She closed the door before he finished the sentence. Down at the precinct, Detective Broussard lasted longer than most believed he would. Retirement loomed, but he clung to the department as if purpose alone could rewrite the past. Each year, on the anniversary of Camille's disappearance, he returned to the levee. He brought a single lily and stood by the water for an hour. No press, no prayers, just silence. "You deserved better, kid," he'd mutter before leaving. By 2006, the letters stopped being replies and started being reminders. Evelyn's handwriting grew shakier, her words shorter. Still no answer. Still waiting. She mailed them anyway. The years moved like the river constant, heavy, slow. The town changed around her. Old diners were replaced by casinos. The small neighborhood swallowed by strip malls and parking lots. People who once whispered about the Red River Girl moved away or forgot. Shreveport's skyline grew brighter while Evelyn's house dimmed. Yet through all of it, Camille's room remained untouched. Her bed still made, her books still stacked by the window, her perfume bottle half full on the dresser. Sometimes, Evelyn would sit on the edge of that bed, close her eyes, and pretend she could still hear her daughter's voice. But pretending was the only thing time hadn't stolen. Do you believe the past ever really goes away? Or does it just wait for the right voice to call it back? By the time 2010 arrived, Camille Harper was no longer a person in Shreveport's memory. She was a story. Her face, once printed on missing posters, had become a ghostly outline in the minds of a younger generation that hadn't lived through the panic. The city moved on, but it kept her name alive in a different, twisted way. They called her the Red River Girl. Bartenders told her story to new arrivals, like a local warning. Don't walk near the levee at night. That's where the river took her. Teenagers dared each other to visit the old site where her car had been found. Some claimed to hear a ringtone echoing through the fog. Others swore they saw her reflection in the water. It became folklore, easy to repeat, easier to distort. Every retelling drifted further from the truth. The preacher's name was changed, the time of her disappearance shifted, and the story became something to scare children with instead of a wound that still bled. But Evelyn Harper didn't forget. She heard the whispers, saw the teenagers laughing near the river, and it tore through her like a fresh wound. She wasn't a ghost. She told anyone who'd listen. She was my daughter. But by then, even the people who pitied her had learned to look away. The Red River itself became an accomplice to the lie, calm, unbothered, reflecting a skyline that grew brighter every year while Evelyn's home stayed locked in the same dim light. The only one who still remembered the true story was Detective Alan Broussard. Though retired, he kept case number CH 2002 inches, a locked drawer beside his old badge. Every year, on the anniversary, he'd drive out to the levee with that same folder on the passenger seat. He'd open it, flip through the yellowing photos, the tire mark scans, the evidence labels, and then close it again. "We failed you," he'd whisper. "But I haven't forgotten." When the city celebrated the new casino district opening, Evelyn stayed home, staring out her window as fireworks lit up the night sky. Somewhere across town, people toasted to progress, to brighter days, while she sat clutching the same photo she'd held for 20 years. In Shreveport, memory was selective. The city forgot the truth, but kept the legend. The girl they once searched for had become a bedtime story. By 2021, time had done what it always does. It covered wounds with dust and called them healed. The Shreveport Police Department was no exception. Old evidence boxes sat stacked in forgotten corners of the archives. Labels faded, tape peeling. Cases no one spoke of anymore. Cases like CH 2002, Harper, Camille. The new Forensic Renewal Initiative began that fall, aiming to digitize decades of unsolved cases. Most officers saw it as busy work, a public relations project dressed as progress. But to Detective Sienna Cortez, one of the new recruits assigned to the task, it was a chance to give silence a voice. Cortez had grown up in Louisiana, not far from Shreveport. She'd heard the story of the Red River Girl as a child, though back then it was just a cautionary tale told around bonfires. When she opened the list of unsolved cases to process, that name caught her eye like a ghost, refusing to rest. She found the box on a high shelf, wedged between two others, labeled with dates she didn't recognize. It was smaller than most, sealed tight and heavy with humidity. Across the top, in faded black marker, were the letters CH2002. Inside, the contents were simple but haunting. Camille's bracelet, the police photos, a soil sample, and a small plastic bag marked clothing fragment, possible biological trace. The paper label had curled with age, but the handwriting was still legible. Property of Detective A. Broussard. Cortez flipped through the accompanying report, frowning as she reached the last page. The fiber sample had never been tested. The report stopped mid-sentence, with a note scribbled in the margin. Send to lab pending authorization. Authorization that never came. She sat there for a long while, staring at the bag through the plastic. 20 years, she murmured. You've been waiting 20 years. When she turned the box over, a small folded slip of paper fell out. It was a letter, one of Evelyn Harper's, dated 2009. It read, "If anyone ever opens this, please don't stop. Someone took her, and he's still breathing." Cortez held the letter like it was alive. She didn't know it yet, but that one forgotten note would reopen a door the whole city had nailed shut. 20 years later, it wasn't the police who called the past. It was the past that called them. For 20 years, no one knew a killer prayed with them, lived beside them, smiled in their photos. Subscribe, because silence doesn't mean safety. Detective Sienna Cortez wasn't the kind of investigator who believed in luck. She believed in time, in what it erases, what it leaves behind, and what it forces you to face. When she reopened the old case file marked CH2002, she didn't see an assignment. She saw a conversation that had been waiting 2 decades for someone to listen. The box from the archive sat on her desk, its cardboard edges warped, its corners soft from years of handling. She peeled away the aged tape, careful not to tear the handwriting that read, "Property of Detective A. Broussard." Inside lay fragments of another life, a photo of Camille smiling at a graduation party, a bracelet dull with time, a file folder brittle from humidity. But tucked near the bottom, wrapped in wax paper, was a fabric fragment, a piece of Camille's blouse. The tag on the evidence bag said, "Biological residue present untested." Cortez frowned. How could something this crucial sit unexamined for 20 years? She logged the item immediately and sent it to the State Forensic Lab for modern analysis, citing new technology, forensic-grade genome sequencing, FGGS, a process that could pull human identity out of genetic dust. Days later, the lab director called her personally. "Detective Cortez," he said, voice tight, "you're not going to believe this." Cortez leaned back in her chair, heart quickening. "Tell me." The sample was viable. We extracted a profile, not a full match, but a familial one. The genetic markers connect to an existing Louisiana lineage. Surname, Hatcher. Cortez froze. As in Deacon Hatcher? That's the family line, yes. But the specific DNA doesn't match him directly. It's a descendant or a close relative. Her pulse began to drum in her ears. That name again. The same one that haunted every dead end in Broussard's reports. The preacher who preached forgiveness and hid behind faith when the truth got too close. She opened the case log and saw Broussard's old note from 2003. Faint and faded, but still readable. Something wrong about Hatcher. The town's faith blinds them. Cortez whispered to herself. Not anymore. For the first time in 2 decades, the evidence had spoken, and it had spoken loud enough to wake the dead. Would you want science to remember what your community tried to forget? Detective Sienna Cortez didn't go straight to the church. She went to the courthouse. In her experience, truth rarely started in sanctuaries. It hid in sealed folders and forgotten signatures. She requested every public record tied to the Hatcher family, expecting marriage licenses, property deeds, and baptism rosters. What she found instead were redacted case files and sealed court documents that shouldn't have existed for a man who preached about honesty. 2 of the files referenced complaints of inappropriate contact between Deacon Paul Hatcher and women in his congregation. Both were labeled as resolved internally. There were also disciplinary reports from a small private seminary outside Baton Rouge, allegations buried under confidentiality agreements and closed-door settlements. The paper trail smelled of protection, not penance. Cortez exhaled slowly, her jaw tightening as she flipped through each page. The pattern was clear. Accusations buried under faith, victims silenced by the weight of reputation. It wasn't new, it was maintenance. A man like Hatcher didn't need to hide behind a church. The church did it for him. When Cortez brought the findings to her captain, he frowned. "You're stirring up ghosts, Sienna. Hatcher's been untouchable for years. He's old now. Let it go." She stared him down. "Tell that to Camille Harper's mother." Her next stop was Street Paul's Fellowship Hall, the church Hatcher once led. The building was different now, new pastor, fresh paint, but the smell of candle wax and hymns still clung to the walls. She walked through the halls slowly, scanning the photographs of smiling faces in choir robes. There he was, front and center, Deacon Hatcher, smiling, hand on the shoulder of a boy who couldn't have been older than 12. Cortez felt her stomach twist. "You always liked the spotlight, didn't you?" she muttered under her breath. Back at her office, she added a single note to her case file. Faith built his armor. Reputation kept it polished. But that armor was cracking now. The DNA had spoken once. The paperwork had whispered twice. And somewhere in between, the truth was starting to raise its voice. Detective Sienna Cortez stared at the DNA report long after the lab had gone quiet for the night. The name Hatcher sat at the top of the results page like a wound that refused to close. But as she dug deeper into the genealogical data, the truth sharpened into focus. The sample taken from Camille Harper's blouse didn't belong to Deacon Paul Hatcher himself. It pointed to someone younger, someone descended from him. The match led directly to Caleb Hatcher, the deacon's only son. A 42-year-old contractor, husband, father, and lifelong resident of Shreveport. His company had handled renovations for several local schools and churches, including Street Paul's. The deeper Cortez searched, the more she saw how easily Caleb had blended in, always near, always trusted, always invisible. She pulled up an archived photo from the 2002 community search, dozens of volunteers standing by the levee, flashlights raised, and there, in the second row, was a face she recognized. Caleb Hatcher, 20 years younger, holding a poster with Camille's photo on it. Her heart thudded once, hard. "You helped them look for her," she whispered. "You were standing right there." She scrolled through more files, finding records that made the picture clearer. Caleb had worked under his father's ministry as a youth outreach assistant, responsible for community events and construction projects. He had access to vehicles, storage sheds, secluded church properties, and no one had ever questioned him. The pattern was grotesque in its simplicity. A preacher who shielded himself behind faith, a son who learned to use it as cover, a town too loyal to ask what was hiding in plain sight. Cortez picked up her phone and called the lab. "Run a secondary verification," she said. "Full spectrum alignment. I want confirmation beyond question." The analyst hesitated. "Detective, you already have your match." She leaned forward, voice cold and steady. "Then I want to hear it out loud." A pause, then the words that changed everything. Confirmed, the DNA from Camille Harper's blouse belongs to Caleb Hatcher. Cortez closed her eyes, a slow exhale leaving her lips. "So it was never the preacher after all," she said quietly. "It was his son." She looked down at the open case file, 2 generations of faith, 1 generation of blood. The case didn't whisper this time, it sang through the blood. Detective Sienna Cortez had read Caleb Hatcher's name at least a dozen times before the weight of it settled in. She knew that name. Everyone in Shreveport did. He was the man who organized charity drives, rebuilt storm-damaged homes, and sponsored youth sports teams through his construction company. He was the kind of man people waved to from their porches, the kind whose smile earned trust before his words did. For most of her career, Cortez had hunted ghosts, killers who hid in the dark, predators who moved through shadows. Caleb Hatcher wasn't hiding. He was everywhere. She began the surveillance quietly. No warnings, no warrants, just observation. Every morning at 6, he left his house in a Navy truck, with his company's name printed neatly on the side. At lunch, He'd stop at the same fast food joint on Market Street. Around dusk, he'd park outside street. Paul's church, the same one where his father once preached, sitting in his truck for 10 minutes before driving home. Routine. Predictable. Clean. But routine is where truth lives. Cortez watched him for 2 weeks, documenting every move. He wasn't cautious. He didn't seem worried. That was what bothered her most, his calm. Either he truly believed he was untouchable, or he'd lived so long with the secret that guilt no longer registered. The break came one humid Thursday afternoon. Cortez followed him into the same fast food place, her unmarked car parked across the lot. She watched him order a burger, coffee, and fries, then eat alone, scrolling through his phone like any other man trying to fill silence. When he finished, he crumpled his napkin, tossed his trash in the bin, and walked out. She waited exactly 3 minutes, then slipped on gloves and retrieved his discarded coffee cup and straw, sealing them inside an evidence bag. She labeled it Hatcher, Caleb Public Discard Collection. That night, as she dropped the sample off at the lab, she didn't feel adrenaline. She felt anger. Not at him, not even at the department that failed 20 years ago, but at the idea that for 2 decades, this man had walked into churches, shaken hands, prayed aloud, and smiled into cameras, all while knowing where Camille Harper was. Cortez left the lab without looking back. "Run it," she told the technician. "Let's see what he's been hiding behind all that holiness. What if the man who built hope in your town was the one who buried its soul?" It took 48 hours for the lab to call, 2 days that stretched like years. Detective Sienna Cortez spent them pacing her office, pretending to work other files, while her mind stayed fixed on the one that mattered. When the phone finally rang, she didn't even let it finish the first ring. "Tell me." The technician on the other end hesitated before answering. "Detective, it's a full match." Cortez gripped the edge of her desk. "To what?" "The DNA extracted from the blouse, in evidence, file CH2002. It's a 1 to 100% match to the sample collected from Caleb Hatcher's coffee cup." Silence flooded the room. For a moment, even her heartbeat felt like it had stopped. She turned to the board behind her, photos of Camille Harper smiling at 22, maps of the levee, the blurred newspaper clippings that called her the Red River Girl, and below them, a smaller photo taken from the 2002 search efforts, dozens of volunteers lined up with flashlights. There, half hidden in the background, was Caleb, a young man holding a missing poster, a man who had stood beside Evelyn Harper, comforting her while the cameras rolled, a man who prayed with her, hugged her, and promised to bring Camille home. The air left Cortez's lungs like a punch. She pulled the photo off the board, staring at it. He wasn't just a suspect now. He was a ghost from every angle of the story, the helper, the witness, the wolf who wore the flock's trust like armor. Cortez called the lab again. "Run the report twice," she said. Her voice didn't waver, but her hand trembled slightly as she set the phone down. The confirmation came the next morning. "Verification complete. The match is absolute." She sat in silence, watching dawn break through her blinds, the sun splitting into bars of gold across her wall. This was the moment Camille Harper's story began to breathe again. But it wasn't relief that filled her chest, it was fury. He hadn't just killed Camille. He had buried her memory under sermons and smiles, and made the entire city thank him for it. Cortez closed the file, whispering through her teeth, "Not anymore." Detective Sienna Cortez didn't go home that night. She sat alone in the precinct archives, surrounded by ghosts printed on paper photos, reports, church bulletins, all pieces of the same puzzle that had been sitting in plain sight for 20 years. The file on Caleb Hatcher lay open on her desk. His life looked perfect. No criminal record, steady income, a family, even commendations for his charity work. He was the kind of man people built monuments to, not mugshots. But the truth was uglier than any file could hold. She traced his name through old community lists and found it over and over again: volunteer rosters, food drives, charity fundraisers. There it was again. Volunteer, Harper Search Team, July 2002. Caleb hadn't just been part of the search, he'd been one of the coordinators. He was the man who organized flashlight routes, the one who kept Evelyn Harper company when hope started to break. Every detail felt like a knife. He hadn't only hidden in plain sight, he'd stood in the middle of the search, watching everyone hunt for a body he'd already buried. Cortez scrolled through archived footage from the local news. There he was again, younger, standing beside Evelyn during an interview, his hand on her shoulder as she wept. The reporter had called him a beacon of compassion in a time of darkness. Her stomach turned. She watched his face freeze on the screen, that faint, composed smile that now looked like mockery. It wasn't kindness. It was ownership. Cortez closed her laptop and stared at the ceiling. The weight of what she'd found pressed down like the humid Louisiana air outside. She could feel it, the deception that had festered beneath 20 years of sermons, charity, and small-town faith. Caleb had fooled them all, the police, the church, the public, even the mother of the girl he killed. He'd prayed for her every Sunday, spoken her name in vigils, begged for her return. And every time he folded his hands, he did it knowing exactly where she was. He prayed for her return every Sunday, standing on the grave he dug himself. Dawn arrived like a held breath over Shreveport's soft light leaking through the humidity, a city that had been placid now stirring with controlled motion. Detective Sienna Cortez watched the street from the unmarked SUV, the warrant warm in her jacket pocket. The team moved with the quiet precision of people who carry other people's grief for a living. Plain cars, plain faces, radios clipped to belts, no sirens, no show. Caleb Hatcher's house sat back from the road behind a low iron fence, the yard trimmed, a pickup with his company logo in the drive. For 2 decades, he'd worn the image of a good man like Armor Trust, bought with sweat and Sunday service. Today, that image would crack. Cortez felt the weight of every family who'd never been returned as the team surrounded the property. She thought of Evelyn Harper, of the letters she'd written, and the light she'd kept burning for 21 years. She thought of a young nurse who'd left her shift and never reached her porch. There are moments in this work when you understand how small your role is next to the damage done. Arrest is only the first of many reckonings. They knocked. Breath held. The door opened. Caleb stood there, shirt half tucked, hair still mussed from sleep. He didn't bolt. He didn't shout. He offered a polite smile that looked suddenly obscene in the cold morning air. "Caleb Hatcher, Shreveport Police," Cortez said, voice even. "We have a warrant." He stepped back like a man who'd been waiting for this call and yet, surprised the world finally noticed him. No resistance, no theatrics. He was led from the house in cuffs under a sky that felt like judgment. Neighbors watched from behind blinds. A man brought his toddler to the window and pointed, as if naming a monster. A woman crossing the street dropped her coffee. Cameras blinked in the distance, the city's appetite for scandal dull now to stunned silence. The air tasted like metal and summer. Inside the house, officers moved methodically. The shed behind the garage held the first hints of what the river had tried to hide. A shoebox with yellowed clippings, a rusted trowel with mud along its edges, and a small chain that made Cortez's hands go cold, the bracelet link from Camille's file. Evidence that had waited, patient and ugly, for the day someone would look long enough to see it. What if one fingerprint could drain 20 years of lies? The shed smelled of oil and damp wood. Dust coated every surface like time's final fingerprint. Detective Sienna Cortez stood in the doorway, her flashlight steady, her stomach tightening with each step inside. The air was thick, quiet, too quiet. Nothing in the room moved, but everything seemed to breathe guilt. An officer opened a metal cabinet near the back wall. "Detective," he said softly, lifting a small plastic container wrapped in cloth. Inside, a silver bracelet caught the light. The initials were still visible, engraved faintly into the charm. C.H. Camille Harper. Cortez stared at it without speaking. Her pulse, a steady roar in her ears. Next to it sat a box filled with newspaper clippings, yellowed headlines from 2002. each one circling back to Camille's disappearance. Some were marked with pen strokes, underlined phrases like "last seen near Levee" and "search teams expand west." It wasn't nostalgia. It was record-keeping. He had tracked the story like a hunter revisiting the site of his first kill. "Bag everything," Cortez ordered quietly. Her voice felt smaller than usual, as if even sound had to respect the dead in this place. Near the corner, another officer crouched by a pair of mud-stained work shoes. The tread was caked with hardened clay, reddish-brown, the same soil taken from the levee 2 decades ago. Cortez exhaled sharply, feeling the puzzle pieces align in her mind. The Red River hadn't hidden Camille all these years. Caleb had. He'd built his shed, his life, his identity on top of her memory, thinking time would keep him safe. Back inside the house, Caleb sat at the dining table, hands cuffed, expression blank. The calm he'd worn earlier began to fracture under the sterile glare of evidence bags and camera flashes. When Cortez walked in holding the bracelet, his jaw tightened just slightly. "It was supposed to be just a talk," he said finally, his voice low, almost measured. "She said she'd tell someone." The confession hung in the air like humidity before a storm. "You killed her because she told the truth," Cortez said flatly. Caleb looked up, his face unreadable. "No," he whispered. "I killed her because she didn't lie." Cortez's stomach turned. Evil doesn't always scream. It sometimes explains itself. Caleb Hatcher didn't ask for a lawyer. He didn't weep, shout, or pray. He spoke with the same calm voice that had fooled a congregation for 20 years, each word sliding out like it had been rehearsed in silence. "It was supposed to be just a talk," he repeated, eyes locked on the table. "She was upset after Bible study. I told her I could give her a ride home. She said she didn't trust me, that she'd tell someone what she thought I'd done." He exhaled, a sound so slow it barely registered. "I just wanted her to stop screaming." Detective Sienna Cortez didn't interrupt. She'd heard every variation of confession a human being could offer: denial, panic, excuses. But this was different. Caleb wasn't trying to convince her. He was confessing the way some people give sermons: to be heard, not forgiven. "She hit her head when I grabbed her arm," he continued. "It was quick. I thought if I could just make it go away, everything would stay normal." He looked up then, and for the first time, the mask slipped. "I prayed after. Every day. Sometimes twice. With her. And..." Cortez leaned forward, voice quiet but sharp. "Where is she, Caleb?" He hesitated only once. "Behind the church," he said finally. "The old field near the riverbank. I buried her there. My father didn't know." The search began within the hour. By dusk, officers marked a perimeter behind St. Paul's Church, their shovels cutting through roots and wet soil. It didn't take long. Just a few feet down, one officer froze. "Detective," he said, voice breaking, "we found her." The field fell silent except for the soft rush of the nearby river. A small cross still stood crooked near the edge, overgrown with weeds. Time had disguised the place, but not erased it. Cortez stepped back, letting the forensic team work. She looked toward the water, her throat tight. The river that once swallowed truth now gave it back, unwillingly, but completely. Across town, Evelyn Harper watched the broadcast alone. The reporter's voice trembled over the image of police tents and floodlights. She didn't cry. She only pressed her hand against the TV screen, her voice breaking into a whisper. "You're home now, baby. You're finally home." Outside, rain began to fall again, light, quiet, forgiving. The river finally gave her back. He looked like faith, but he was its corruption. Subscribe, because evil doesn't always wear a mask. The trial of Caleb Hatcher opened on a gray morning in March 2024. The courthouse in Shreveport overflowed with faces that had once called him a friend, a mentor, a man of faith. Now they came to see what was left of the myth they had believed in for so long. The crowd was split down the center, half glaring, half praying. Every bench carried its own version of grief or denial. Caleb entered through the side door in cuffs, shoulders straight, expression blank. No eye contact, no apology, only silence. When the judge asked for his plea, his lawyer stood instead. "Your Honor, my client enters an Alford plea, acknowledging the prosecution holds sufficient evidence for conviction." Gasps rippled through the room. He couldn't even say the word guilty. At the prosecution's table, Detective Sienna Cortez sat beside District Attorney Marla Tinsley, her face set in a calm that didn't feel like calm at all. Years of digging, doubting, and chasing had brought her here. But closure was a fragile word. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like exhale after drowning. The prosecution began with Dr. Elise Rowan, the forensic analyst who'd retested the blouse fragment. She stepped to the stand, her tone precise but heavy with meaning. "DNA doesn't fade the way people think," she said. "It can degrade, yes, but it doesn't disappear. Truth doesn't decay. It waits." The courtroom fell utterly silent. Every word struck like a hammer on glass. Cortez looked at Evelyn Harper sitting in the front row, a small photo of Camille clasped in her hands. She wasn't crying. She hadn't cried in years. She just sat there, back straight, eyes fixed on the man who had taken her daughter and hid behind sermons. When it came time for the victim's impact statement, Evelyn rose slowly, the room holding its breath. She approached the stand with the quiet dignity of someone who had already buried her pain 1,000 times. Her voice trembled at first, then steadied. "He took her life," she said, holding up the photo for the court to see. "But not her light. That was mine to keep, and I kept it. Every night I left my lamp on. It wasn't for her to find her way home. It was to remind the world she still existed." A single tear traced her cheek, but her voice didn't waver. "Now she's found, now she's home, and he'll never see light again." Even the judge looked away for a moment. When Evelyn returned to her seat, Cortez met her eyes. For the first time, neither woman looked like they were fighting the past. They looked like they'd finally outrun it. The courtroom was no longer divided. The silence that followed was not out of respect. It was the sound of disbelief turning into acceptance. When justice finally speaks, does it heal or does it just remind? The trial lasted 6 days, though to those who had lived its shadow, it felt like decades condensed into a single week. Each day carried the same rhythm: evidence, testimony, silence. It was not drama that filled the courtroom, but exhaustion. By the final day, even the hum of reporters' cameras had faded, replaced by the weight of waiting. When Detective Sienna Cortez took the stand, the gallery leaned forward. She spoke simply, describing what 20 years of waiting had taught her about justice. "It's not about catching a man," she said quietly. "It's about catching the truth before it drowns." The defense tried to paint Caleb as a man broken by guilt, not driven by malice. But guilt is not grief, and the jury saw it. There was no sorrow in him, only self-preservation dressed as remorse. His eyes wandered as the testimonies continued, lingering on anything but the faces that demanded to be seen. When closing arguments ended, the jury left. Minutes passed, then hours. Evelyn Harper sat unmoving in the front row, her daughter's photograph resting against her lap. Her lips moved silently. But it wasn't prayer. It was a conversation. She'd been talking to Camille for 20 years. She wasn't going to stop now. The doors opened. 12 people filed back into the room, their faces pale, their decision already known before it was spoken. "Your Honor," the foreperson said, standing, voice steady. "We find the defendant guilty." No shouting, no cheers, just the sound of breath leaving an entire city at once. Caleb lowered his head, hands tightening around the table edge, his calm finally gone. For the first time, he looked small, like a man crushed under the truth he thought he'd buried forever. Evelyn closed her eyes, her body trembling, but she didn't cry. She simply whispered, "It's done." After the sentencing, Cortez stepped outside the courthouse. The afternoon sun hit the marble steps, warm against her skin. She could hear the faint rush of the Red River beyond the courthouse walls, steady and constant just like the truth Dr. Rowan had spoken of. She thought about everything the case had cost. 2 decades of silence, a mother's endless fight, a girl's stolen life. Justice had arrived late, but it had arrived honest. Her reflection in the courthouse glass looked older, sharper, quieter. She didn't feel victorious. She felt whole. She turned toward the river and spoke softly, not to the city, not to the cameras, but to the ghost who had waited the longest. "Justice doesn't erase time," she said, "but it redefines it." Behind her, the courtroom door closed. The sound was deep, final, like a bell tolling through water. The gavel didn't close the story, it opened its silence. The first vigil was small, a handful of candles, a quiet crowd, and the sound of the Red River moving softly under the bridge where Camille Harper's name had once been whispered only in sorrow. Now, 20 years after she vanished, the city spoke her name with reverence, no longer as a mystery, but as a memory reclaimed. Detective Sienna Cortez stood among them, the warm glow of lanterns flickering across her face. Around her, the people of Shreveport held candles wrapped in wax paper cups, each flame bending slightly in the river breeze. No microphones, no speeches, just silence and light. The same city that once turned away now stood shoulder to shoulder, finally looking inward. At the front of the gathering, Evelyn Harper placed a single lily by the railing. She was older now, her hands slower, her hair turned silver, but her eyes still carried the quiet strength of someone who had walked through fire and refused to disappear. The years had not erased her grief, but they had reshaped it into something gentler, a promise fulfilled. A soft voice read from the newly engraved memorial plaque fixed to the bridge. "Never stop listening when the wind carries a name." It was Evelyn's quote, now etched into stone for everyone to see, a mother's message to a city that had once buried its truth under fear and fatigue. People lowered their lanterns into the river. One by one, the small lights drifted away, merging with the slow current. Cortez watched them float past her boots, glowing faintly like stars that had fallen into the water. The river, once a graveyard of secrets, now carried the memory forward light instead of loss. A child tugged at Cortez's sleeve. "Did you find the bad man?" he asked softly. Cortez knelt down, meeting his eyes. "Yes," she said, "but we also found something better." "What's that?" "The truth," she whispered. "And it doesn't get lost anymore." The boy nodded and placed his lantern on the water beside the others. Together, they watched it drift into the distance, swallowed by hundreds of other flickering lights, the quiet proof that remembrance was stronger than silence. Tonight, the city didn't mourn, it remembered, and remembering, at last, felt like peace. By the following spring, Camille Harper's name had moved beyond Shreveport. It reached classrooms, case studies, and the next generation of detectives who would learn that justice was not just a process, it was persistence. The Louisiana State University Forensic Science Department added a new entry to its curriculum, Case Study CH2002, the Harper Investigation. It wasn't about failure or victory, it was about endurance. About the way one small, forgotten clue, a single piece of fabric can outlast 20 years of neglect and still speak louder than silence. Professor Dr. Elise Rowan, who once testified in the trial, began every lecture the same way. Technology gave us the answer, but it was compassion that kept us listening. Students took notes in reverent, quiet, understanding that the lesson wasn't just scientific, it was human. Every case file, she told them, was someone's unfinished story. Back in Shreveport, Detective Sienna Cortez received the Louisiana State Award for Distinguished Service in Criminal Justice. The ceremony was formal, staged at City Hall beneath bright banners and handshakes. But Cortez didn't smile for the cameras. Her speech was short, honest, and heavy. "Justice is never fast, and it's rarely fair," she said. "It's the art of not giving up when everyone else already has." Applause followed, but her mind wasn't on the stage. It was on Evelyn Harper, sitting quietly in the front row, holding a folded piece of paper instead of flowers. Evelyn had refused the city's offer to rename the river trail after her daughter. "You can't rename what already belongs to her," she told the mayor. "That river remembers." The story of Camille Harper changed how Shreveport treated its past. Old files were reopened. Forgotten names were spoken again. Detectives began revisiting unsolved cases with new technology, new eyes, and a new understanding that silence was never the end. And within those efforts, Cortez found something she hadn't expected: gratitude from strangers. Parents she'd never met stopped her in grocery stores, whispering, "Thank you for finding her." But Cortez always shook her head. "It wasn't me," she'd say. "It was her. Camille found herself. We just learned how to listen." The ripples of truth moved outward, from one case, one woman, one city, until even the places that once forgot began to remember. By the following spring, Camille Harper's name had moved beyond Shreveport. It reached classrooms, case studies, and the next generation of detectives who would learn that justice was not just a process, it was persistence. The Louisiana State University Forensic Science Department added a new entry to its curriculum: Case Study CH-2002, the Harper Investigation. It wasn't about failure or victory, it was about endurance. About the way one small, forgotten clue, a single piece of fabric, can outlast 20 years of neglect and still speak louder than silence. Professor Dr. Elise Rowan, who once testified in the trial, began every lecture the same way: "Technology gave us the answer. But it was compassion that kept us listening." Students took notes in reverent, quiet, understanding that the lesson wasn't just scientific, it was human. Every case file, she told them, was someone's unfinished story. Back in Shreveport, Detective Sienna Cortez received the Louisiana State Award for Distinguished Service in Criminal Justice. The ceremony was formal, staged at City Hall, beneath bright banners and handshakes. But Cortez didn't smile for the cameras. Her speech was short, honest, and heavy. "Justice is never fast, and it's rarely fair," she said. "It's the art of not giving up when everyone else already has." Applause followed, but her mind wasn't on the stage. It was on Evelyn Harper, sitting quietly in the front row, holding a folded piece of paper instead of flowers. Evelyn had refused the city's offer to rename the river trail after her daughter. "You can't rename what already belongs to her," she told the mayor. "That river remembers." The story of Camille Harper changed how Shreveport treated its past. Old files were reopened. Forgotten names were spoken again. Detectives began revisiting unsolved cases with new technology, new eyes, and a new understanding that silence was never the end. And within those efforts, Cortez found something she hadn't expected: gratitude from strangers. Parents she'd never met stopped her in grocery stores, whispering, "Thank you for finding her." But Cortez always shook her head. "It wasn't me," she'd say. "It was her. Camille found herself. We just learned how to listen." The ripples of truth moved outward from one case, one woman, one city, until even the places that once forgot began to remember. The river was calm the night Detective Sienna Cortez returned to the bridge. The lanterns from the vigil were long gone, but their glow still lingered in memory. The plaque gleamed faintly under the streetlights, the engraved words catching what little moonlight slipped through the clouds. "Never stop listening when the wind carries a name." She ran her fingers across the cold metal, tracing the letters as though they were part of a prayer. This was the place where the story began to heal, where a girl once lost had finally come home. The current murmured softly below, steady, unhurried, ancient. For the first time in years, Cortez felt the weight she'd carried for so long begin to loosen. She'd solved harder cases, maybe even bloodier ones, but none had ever followed her into sleep the way Camille Harper had. Maybe because this wasn't just about crime, it was about the way one person's absence could hollow out a city's soul, and how truth, when it finally surfaced, could fill it again. Cortez thought about how far the truth had traveled, from a mother's letters to a dusty evidence box, to a forgotten scrap of fabric, to a single sequence of DNA that refused to stay silent. Technology had uncovered the truth, but compassion had delivered it. That was the difference between solving a case and restoring a life. She leaned on the railing, the night air brushing her cheek. Somewhere in the dark, the faint sound of church bells drifted from the city center, echoing across the water. They didn't sound like mourning anymore, they sounded like gratitude. At the far end of the bridge, a small group of students passed by, carrying books and murmuring softly. One of them pointed to the plaque and smiled. "That's her," the girl said. "The Red River case. We studied it last semester." Cortez turned, but said nothing. She didn't need to. Camille's story was no longer hers. To tell it belonged to everyone now. As she walked back toward her car, she glanced once more at the river. The surface shimmered faintly under the streetlights, as if hundreds of lanterns still floated there, guiding the lost home. Some stories end with closure, others end with memory. Camille Harper's ended with light. In a city of thousands, one young woman refused to be forgotten. And because she held on, so did justice.